They found the cigarette butts first, not in ashtrays or designated disposal areas, but scattered across the compound grounds at the prisoner of war camp on Oahu, Hawaii. Each one represented something that Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto could not reconcile with everything he had been taught about the enemy. The butts were long, sometimes half the original cigarette length, still wrapped in white paper with brand names he couldn't read. Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield. The American guards had smoked perhaps 10 or 15 draws, then simply dropped them and walked away. Yamamoto had been captured on Saipan in July of 1944, after his unit was overrun during the final American push across the island. He had expected execution. Japanese military doctrine taught that capture meant dishonor worse than death, that the enemy would torture prisoners, that Americans were barbarians who respected no codes of warfare. Instead, he had been given water within an hour of capture, medical attention for the shrapnel wounds in his leg and shoulder, and food that same evening. The cognitive dissonance had begun immediately, but it was the cigarettes that broke through his understanding of the war itself. In the Japanese military, tobacco was precious. A soldier's ration, when available, consisted of perhaps 10 cigarettes per week, sometimes fewer. These were smoked down to the absolute end until the paper burned fingertips, until there was literally nothing left to hold. Yamamoto had watched men in his unit collect the tiny remnants of tobacco from finished cigarettes, roll them in whatever paper was available, and smoke those desperate combinations. He had done it himself. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Now, in this camp on Hawaiian soil, he watched American guards light fresh cigarettes every hour. They smoked them casually, often while performing other tasks, sometimes forgetting them in ashtrays where they burned down untouched. When they finished, which was rarely at the actual end of the cigarette, they dropped them on the ground and lit new ones from packs that seemed inexhaustible. The packs themselves were discarded with several cigarettes still inside. Yamamoto had watched a guard throw away a pack with 4 cigarettes remaining, because it was apparently easier than carrying it. The first night in the camp, after the evening count, Yamamoto and 3 other Japanese prisoners waited until the guards had moved to the far end of the compound. Then they carefully collected the cigarette butts from the ground near the fence line. There were dozens. They worked methodically, gathering each one, checking to see how much tobacco remained. Some butts were barely smoked. One that Yamamoto picked up was easily half its original length, perhaps 2 inches of unburned tobacco wrapped in paper that showed no signs of moisture or damage. An American had smoked it for perhaps 2 minutes, then discarded it. The prisoners took their collection back to their barracks. In the dim light after the guards had finished their rounds, they carefully unwrapped each butt, separating the remaining tobacco from the paper. They worked in silence, a ritual of scarcity performed with the waste products of abundance. By the end of their work, they had recovered enough tobacco to roll 8 complete cigarettes, using paper torn from the margins of old Japanese newspapers that had somehow made their way to the camp. 8 cigarettes from what the Americans had thrown away. Yamamoto smoked one of those reconstructed cigarettes that night. The tobacco was American, richer and stronger than the harsh Japanese brands he had known. As he drew the smoke into his lungs, he thought about the guard who had discarded the half-smoked cigarette he now consumed. That man had been so satiated, so overwhelmed with abundance, that he had not bothered to finish what he was smoking before lighting another. For the first time since his capture, Yamamoto began to understand that Japan might not simply lose battles or lose territory. Japan might lose the war itself because the enemy possessed resources so vast that waste was meaningless. The understanding Yamamoto reached that night in the camp did not emerge from vacuum. It was built on foundations laid years earlier, constructed from official pronouncements, military indoctrination, and the material reality of life in wartime Japan. To comprehend what the discarded cigarettes meant to Japanese prisoners, one must first understand what they had been taught about America and what they had experienced in their own nation's war economy. Japanese military propaganda in the 1930s and early 1940s presented a carefully constructed narrative about the Western powers, particularly the United States. American society was portrayed as decadent, morally corrupt, individualistic to the point of weakness. The Japanese soldier was taught that Americans lacked fighting spirit, that they valued personal comfort over duty, that they would collapse when faced with determined resistance. This narrative was not simply motivational rhetoric. It was embedded in tactical doctrine, in strategic planning, in the fundamental assumptions that guided Japanese military operations. But alongside these characterizations of American weakness ran another thread in the propaganda, one that seemed contradictory but was actually complementary. The Americans, Japanese soldiers were told, were suffering under the weight of their own economic system. Capitalism created inefficiency, inequality, and industrial weakness. The American economy was portrayed as fragile, dependent on resources from abroad, vulnerable to disruption. Japanese forces would cut off American access to rubber from Southeast Asia, to oil from the Dutch East Indies, to strategic materials from across the Pacific. Without these resources, American industrial capacity would falter. The ordinary Japanese soldier received these messages through multiple channels. Military newspapers published articles about American unemployment during the Depression years of the 1930s. Officers delivered lectures about the inefficiency of democratic decision-making compared to Japan's unified command under the emperor. Training exercises emphasized Japanese spiritual superiority over American material focus. The message was consistent. Japan would win not despite having fewer resources, but because Japanese discipline and spirit would overcome American material advantages. This propaganda narrative found fertile ground because it aligned with what Japanese soldiers could observe in their own lives. Japan in the 1940s was a nation mobilized for total war. Every aspect of civilian and military life reflected scarcity and careful resource management. Rationing had begun in earnest in 1940, initially covering rice, then expanding to include nearly every commodity. By 1942, the rationing system touched everything from clothing to cooking oil to soap. For soldiers, scarcity was even more pronounced. Military rations were calculated with precision. A Japanese infantry soldier in the field received approximately 23 ounces of rice per day as his primary food source. This was supplemented with small amounts of barley, preserved vegetables, miso paste, and occasionally fish or meat. The total daily ration provided roughly 2,800 calories when fully supplied, which was often not the case in forward areas where supply lines were stretched or broken. Tobacco rations reflected the same careful economy. When available, a soldier might receive 10 cigarettes per week. These were typically strong, harsh blends produced domestically from tobacco grown in Japan, Korea, or Formosa. The cigarettes were thin, the paper was coarse, and the tobacco was of lower quality than premium civilian brands that had been available before the war. Soldiers treasured these rations. They smoked slowly, making each cigarette last as long as physically possible. They never wasted tobacco. Officers received slightly better rations, but still operated under the same scarcity. A junior officer might receive 20 cigarettes per week, a senior officer perhaps 30. But even at these higher levels, waste was unthinkable. Every resource was precious. Every gram of tobacco represented agricultural land, labor, transportation, and processing capacity that could have been devoted to other war needs. The entire economy operated on the principle that nothing could be spared, nothing could be wasted. Japanese civilians faced even stricter limitations. By 1943, urban residents received rice rations of approximately 12 ounces per day, supplemented with inferior grains like millet and barley. Tobacco for civilians became increasingly rare. Many people gave up smoking entirely, saving what little tobacco was available for soldiers at the front. Those who continued smoking often resorted to substitutes, drying and rolling plant leaves that provided some satisfaction, even if they bore little resemblance to actual tobacco. This culture of scarcity created specific behaviors and psychological frameworks. Japanese soldiers learned to conserve everything. They ate every grain of rice in their bowls. They repaired uniforms until the fabric could no longer hold stitches. They collected and reused anything that might have value. Ammunition was precious. Soldiers were trained to make every shot count. Equipment that broke was repaired, not replaced. Vehicles that ran out of fuel were pushed or towed rather than abandoned. The entire military culture emphasized making do with what was available, stretching resources to their absolute limits. Within this context, the concept of waste was not simply inefficient, it was morally wrong. Wasting resources meant denying those resources to other soldiers, to other units, to the nation itself. Officers who allowed waste in their commands faced severe reprimands. Enlisted men who damaged or lost equipment faced punishment. The ethic of conservation was reinforced through both practical necessity and ideological commitment. Yamamoto had internalized these values through 4 years of military service before his capture. He had joined the army in 1940 as a 17-year-old volunteer, motivated by a combination of patriotic duty and economic necessity. His family farmed a small plot in rural Kyushu, and the military offered steady pay, food, and the honor of serving the emperor. His basic training at a camp near Kumamoto had emphasized physical hardship, ideological indoctrination, and resource discipline. He learned to march 20 miles with full pack on minimal rations. He learned to clean his rifle with whatever materials were available when proper cleaning supplies ran out. He learned that comfort was weakness, that hardship built character, that the Japanese soldier's spiritual strength would overcome any material disadvantage. These were not abstract lessons. They were demonstrated daily through the conditions of military life. By 1943, when Yamamoto's unit deployed to Saipan as part of the island's garrison force, scarcity had become even more pronounced. American submarines were destroying Japanese merchant shipping at an accelerating rate. Supply convoys that had once moved freely across the Pacific now faced deadly gauntlets. Ships carrying food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment were sunk before reaching their destinations. The garrison on Saipan received irregular supplies, often going weeks without fresh rations or replacement equipment. Yamamoto's unit supplemented military rations by cultivating small gardens, by fishing in the waters around the island, by carefully managing whatever supplies did arrive. Cigarettes became especially scarce. Yamamoto remembered going 6 weeks without any tobacco ration in the spring of 1944. When a supply ship finally arrived and distribution was made, he received 8 cigarettes. He made them last 12 days, smoking each one down to a fragment so small it burned his lips. When American forces invaded Saipan in June of 1944, Yamamoto fought with his unit in the defense of the island's central highlands. He experienced the overwhelming firepower of American naval bombardment, the constant presence of American aircraft, the seemingly endless waves of Marines supported by tanks and artillery. His unit was pushed back, surrounded, and finally overrun. He was wounded by shell fragments and captured by Marines who appeared as surprised to take prisoners as he was to become one. The transition from battlefield to captivity involved a series of procedures that American forces had refined through 2 years of Pacific combat. Yamamoto was searched, his wounds were dressed by a Navy corpsman, and he was tagged with a numbered card that identified him as a prisoner. Within 6 hours of capture, he was aboard a transport ship heading to a rear area facility. Within 3 days, he was on Oahu, processed into a prisoner of war camp that housed several hundred Japanese prisoners in a compound of barracks surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers. The camp operated under Geneva Convention protocols, though Japan had never ratified the convention. American policy toward Japanese prisoners was complicated by Japan's refusal to acknowledge that its soldiers could legitimately surrender. The International Red Cross had no access to Allied prisoners in Japanese hands, and reciprocal treatment was therefore impossible. Nevertheless, American camps followed the convention's basic guidelines regarding food, shelter, medical care, and humane treatment. Yamamoto's initial days in the camp were disorienting. The food was strange but abundant. Breakfast consisted of oatmeal, canned fruit, bread, and coffee. Lunch brought sandwiches, soup, and more coffee. Dinner included meat, potatoes or rice, vegetables, and bread. The portions were larger than his military rations had been even before supply lines deteriorated. Prisoners received approximately 3,000 calories per day, more than many American civilians consumed during wartime rationing. But it was the casual abundance of small things that most disturbed his understanding. Guards drank coffee constantly, pouring cups from large percolators, often drinking half and discarding the rest. Bread appeared at every meal, sometimes going uneaten, eventually thrown away. Prisoners were issued soap, toothpaste, razors, and towels that exceeded in quality anything Yamamoto had received in the Japanese military. The camp had electric lights that ran all night. Water was unlimited, available from taps that never ran dry. And there were the cigarettes. American guards smoked constantly. They received cartons as part of their regular rations, 7 packs of 20 cigarettes per week, 140 cigarettes total. Many guards smoked 2 or even 3 packs per day, well beyond their ration, purchasing additional cigarettes from the post-exchange at subsidized prices. The PX sold cigarettes for 5 cents per pack, roughly 1/10 the civilian price on the mainland. Guards thought nothing of buying several cartons at once. The smoking behavior Yamamoto observed contradicted everything his military experience had taught him about resource management. Guards lit cigarettes, took several draws, then became distracted by a conversation or a task and let them burn down in ashtrays. They stubbed out half-smoked cigarettes to light fresh ones. They left packs sitting on tables, on window ledges, in vehicles, sometimes forgetting them entirely. The waste was not malicious or even conscious. It was the behavior of people who had never experienced scarcity, who had no framework for conservation because conservation had never been necessary. Yamamoto was not alone in noticing this pattern. Other prisoners, men from different units and different islands, all reported the same observations. They discussed it in the barracks after evening count, speaking in low voices even though the guards did not understand Japanese. The conversations followed similar paths. Initial disbelief gave way to careful observation, then to systematic collection of the discarded cigarettes, then to deeper questions about what this waste implied. One prisoner, a sergeant named Hiroshi Nakamura, who had been captured on Kwajalein, described watching an American guard throw away an entire pack with 3 cigarettes remaining because the pack had gotten slightly crushed in his pocket. Nakamura had retrieved the pack from the trash receptacle. The 3 cigarettes were perfect, undamaged, fully smokable. The guard had discarded them not because they were ruined, but because the slightly bent pack offended his sense of order. This was abundance so complete that aesthetics mattered more than utility. Another prisoner, Private Kenji Sato from a unit that had defended Tinian, reported seeing guards use cigarettes as informal currency, trading them for small favors or services without any sense that they were parting with something valuable. A guard wanted his boots shined to a higher gloss than regulation required. He offered 2 packs of cigarettes, 40 cigarettes total, for this minor service. The prisoner who shined the boots received more tobacco in 10 minutes of work than a Japanese soldier received in a month of combat duty. These observations accumulated into a collective understanding among the prisoners that something fundamental about their assumptions was wrong. The propaganda that had described American economic weakness was contradicted by evidence visible every day. The ideology that emphasized Japanese spiritual superiority over American materialism failed to explain why American guards, supposedly soft and undisciplined, had access to resources that Japanese soldiers, hardened by training and sacrifice, could never obtain. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The interrogation sessions provided additional context that deepened this understanding. American military intelligence was systematically interviewing Japanese prisoners, gathering information about unit compositions, defensive strategies, weapons capabilities, and morale conditions. The interrogators were often Japanese-American Nisei soldiers who spoke both languages fluently and understood cultural contexts that white American officers missed. These interrogators asked detailed questions about supply conditions, ration levels, equipment availability, and logistical support. Yamamoto was interrogated 3 times during his first month in the camp. The sessions were conducted in a small office building within the compound by a Nisei sergeant named Thomas Fujimoto. Fujimoto spoke Japanese with a slight American accent, and his manner was professional but not hostile. He explained that Yamamoto's information would be used to shorten the war and save lives, though he did not specify whose lives. The interrogation covered standard tactical information, but Fujimoto also asked questions that seemed unrelated to immediate military value. How often had Yamamoto's unit received rice rations? Every day when supply lines were functioning? Every other day, or every third day when they were disrupted? How much rice per day? Approximately 650 grams, though the amount decreased as the defense of Saipan continued and supplies dwindled. What other food was provided? Small amounts of canned fish, pickled vegetables, miso paste, and occasionally fresh fish caught locally. How often did the unit receive meat? Perhaps once per week when supplies were good. Not at all during the final month before the American invasion. What about tobacco? Fujimoto asked. How many cigarettes per week? Yamamoto explained the ration system, 10 cigarettes per week when available, sometimes none for extended periods. Did soldiers smoke the entire cigarette? Fujimoto asked. Yamamoto almost laughed at the question. Of course they smoked the entire cigarette. Every soldier smoked until nothing remained. Did they ever throw away partially smoked cigarettes? The question seemed absurd. Why would anyone discard tobacco that could still be smoked? Fujimoto made notes without comment. Then he asked a different kind of question. What did Yamamoto think about American supplies? What did he mean? Yamamoto replied. Fujimoto clarified. Here in the camp, what had Yamamoto observed about American resources? Yamamoto hesitated, uncertain whether honest answers would create problems. Fujimoto reassured him that the question was not a test, that many prisoners had made similar observations, that understanding these perceptions helped American intelligence assess Japanese morale and combat effectiveness. Yamamoto spoke carefully. He had observed that American guards had access to supplies that seemed unlimited. Food was abundant. Equipment was new and well-maintained. Small items that Japanese soldiers would treasure were treated as disposable, particularly cigarettes. He described the half-smoked cigarettes discarded daily, the packs thrown away with cigarettes still inside, the casual abundance that characterized American smoking behavior. Fujimoto nodded. He explained something that Yamamoto found difficult to believe. American cigarette production in 1943 had exceeded 295 billion cigarettes. That number was so large that Yamamoto initially thought he had misunderstood the Japanese translation. 295 billion. Fujimoto wrote the number on paper to clarify. American factories had produced enough cigarettes in a single year to give every person on Earth, including children and non-smokers, approximately 120 cigarettes each. The production was distributed across multiple manufacturers operating at unprecedented scale. R.J. Reynolds, makers of Camel cigarettes, produced approximately 70 billion cigarettes in 1943 from factories in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. American Tobacco Company, producing Lucky Strike brand, manufactured approximately 65 billion cigarettes the same year. Philip Morris produced approximately 40 billion cigarettes. Liggett and Myers, Brown and Williamson, and smaller manufacturers accounted for the remainder. These factories operated 24 hours per day, employing workers in 3 shifts. The machines could produce cigarettes at rates exceeding 2,000 per minute per machine, with multiple machines running simultaneously in each factory. The cigarettes were packaged automatically, cartoned automatically, and shipped in quantities that would have seemed fantastical to Japanese observers. A single freight train leaving Winston-Salem might carry 2 million cigarettes in a single shipment. Military procurement absorbed a substantial portion of this production. The War Department purchased cigarettes at cost and distributed them to service members as part of basic rations. A soldier in a combat zone received 7 packs per week, 140 cigarettes. Support personnel received slightly less, 5 packs per week. But even this reduced ration exceeded what Japanese soldiers received by a factor of 7 to 1. And these were minimums, base rations that could be supplemented by purchases from post exchanges at subsidized prices. The industrial capacity required to produce cigarettes at this scale extended far beyond the cigarette factories themselves. It required tobacco farms across Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Kentucky, and Tennessee producing millions of pounds of leaf tobacco annually. It required paper mills manufacturing cigarette paper in vast quantities. It required printing facilities producing the packaging materials, billions of individual pack wrappers and carton boxes. It required transportation networks moving raw materials to factories and finished products to distribution centers and military supply depots worldwide. Fujimoto explained that cigarettes were just one small example of American industrial production. The same capacity that produced billions of cigarettes produced everything else the military needed at similar scales. Ships, aircraft, tanks, trucks, weapons, ammunition, uniforms, food, medicine, all produced in quantities that Japan could not match. He showed Yamamoto photographs of American factories, massive buildings covering acres of land, assembly lines stretching hundreds of yards, warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with finished products. One photograph showed the Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan, where Ford Motor Company produced B-24 Liberator bombers. The building was over half a mile long, the largest factory building in the world by floor area when it was completed in 1942. At peak production, Willow Run completed 1 B-24 every 63 minutes. The plant employed 42,000 workers and produced over 8,000 aircraft during the war. The entire Japanese aircraft industry, all manufacturers combined, produced approximately 76,000 aircraft total during the entire war from 1941 to 1945. Yamamoto looked at the photographs without speaking. The scale defied comprehension. He had been taught that American industry was inefficient, that democracy created waste and disorder, that Japanese spiritual strength would overcome material disadvantages. But these photographs showed something different. They showed industrial organization so efficient, so productive, that waste became irrelevant. An economy could throw away half-smoked cigarettes when it produced 300 billion cigarettes per year. It could discard slightly damaged packs when production exceeded consumption by such margins that surplus was inevitable. Fujimoto asked another question. What had Yamamoto been told about American war production during his training? Yamamoto recited what he had learned. American factories were vulnerable to disruption. American workers were unreliable, motivated by wages rather than duty. American democracy prevented the unified direction necessary for total war mobilization. Japanese forces would cut American supply lines, denying them access to strategic resources, forcing their industry into decline. Fujimoto made more notes. He thanked Yamamoto for his honesty. He explained that many Japanese prisoners had expressed similar beliefs based on similar training. These beliefs were understandable given the information available to Japanese soldiers. But they were wrong. American industrial production had increased every year since 1941. Factories that had produced consumer goods had converted to military production without significant disruption. Women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, replacing men who had joined the military and adding capacity beyond pre-war levels. Labor disputes were minimal. Production goals were consistently exceeded. The interrogation ended. Yamamoto was escorted back to his barracks. He sat on his bunk and thought about numbers that seemed impossible. 300 billion cigarettes, 8,000 bombers from one factory, 42,000 workers in a single building. The casual waste he observed daily was not aberration or inefficiency. It was the inevitable overflow of production capacity so vast that conservation was unnecessary. Japanese soldiers smoked cigarette butts because Japan produced cigarettes in millions. American soldiers threw away half-smoked cigarettes because America produced cigarettes in hundreds of billions. That night, Yamamoto did not collect discarded cigarette butts from the compound grounds. Other prisoners did, continuing the habit formed in earlier weeks. But Yamamoto understood that the tobacco he might recover was not valuable. It was waste product from a system that generated waste automatically, unconsciously, as a natural consequence of abundance. Collecting it did not represent resourcefulness. It represented the gap between two economies, two industrial systems, two nations fighting a war that had been decided not by courage or spirit but by production capacity measured in numbers too large to visualize. The realization that came to Yamamoto in the interrogation room spread through the prisoner population through informal networks of conversation and shared observation. Men who had fought on different islands, who had served in different units, who had experienced different aspects of the Pacific War, all arrived at similar conclusions when confronted with the material evidence of American abundance. The psychological impact was profound and lasting, creating a crisis of understanding that went beyond simple military defeat. Japanese military culture had prepared soldiers for many possibilities. They were trained to endure hardship, to accept death, to fight against overwhelming odds. What they were not prepared for was the revelation that their entire understanding of the war's fundamental dynamics was wrong. They had been told they were fighting a decadent enemy weakened by luxury and individualism. Instead, they found an enemy so wealthy that luxury was universal, that individual soldiers possessed more personal resources than entire Japanese units. Other prisoners described similar moments of revelation involving different materials. One soldier reported watching American guards discard half-eaten meals, plates still containing substantial amounts of food, simply because they were full or because the food had cooled below optimal serving temperature. The discarded food would have represented a full day's ration for a Japanese soldier. Another prisoner described seeing a guard throw away a pair of boots because the soles were slightly worn, replacing them with new boots from supply stores that seemed limitless. Japanese soldiers repaired boots until the leather could no longer hold stitches, then repaired them again. A tank crew member captured on Tinian reported that American mechanics working on damaged Sherman tanks near his work detail would discard engine parts that still functioned because replacement parts were readily available, and installation of new components was faster than cleaning and reinstalling used ones. He watched them throw away spark plugs, filters, gaskets, and small mechanical components that Japanese mechanics would have carefully preserved and reused. The Americans were not being wasteful by their standards. They were being efficient, recognizing that time was more valuable than materials when materials were abundant. These observations accumulated into a collective understanding that the war was not simply going badly for Japan. The war had been unwinnable from the beginning because the fundamental premise was false. Japan could not compensate for material inferiority through spiritual superiority when the material gap was not narrow but vast, not temporary but structural, not subject to change through Japanese action, but inherent in the industrial capacities of the two nations. Some prisoners responded to this realization with despair. They had sacrificed everything, had fought with absolute commitment, had believed that their service mattered. Now they understood that individual courage and unit cohesion and tactical skill were irrelevant variables in an equation dominated by industrial production. One prisoner, a sergeant who had fought in China since 1937 and who had survived multiple Pacific battles before capture, stopped speaking entirely for 3 weeks after his interrogation. When he finally resumed conversation, he told other prisoners that he felt he had wasted 7 years of his life fighting for a cause that mathematics had already defeated. Other prisoners responded differently, seeking to understand rather than simply to despair. They asked guards questions about American society, about factory work, about how democracy could produce such efficient industrial mobilization. Some guards were willing to discuss these topics, particularly Nisei interpreters who understood both cultures and could explain American systems in terms Japanese prisoners could comprehend. These conversations revealed that American abundance was not accidental or temporary. It was the product of decades of industrial development, of natural resource availability, of technological innovation, of economic systems that incentivized production and efficiency. The cigarette waste that had initially shocked Yamamoto became a teaching example, a tangible demonstration of abstract economic principles. Fujimoto, during a later conversation, explained the complete supply chain that delivered cigarettes to military personnel. Tobacco farmers in North Carolina sold their crops to manufacturers at prices supported by government agricultural programs. Factories processed the tobacco using machines that represented significant capital investment, but that reduced labor costs per unit produced. Finished cigarettes were packaged, shipped via rail or truck to ports, loaded onto transport ships, moved across the Pacific to forward supply bases, and distributed through military supply networks to individual units and soldiers. At every stage of this process, efficiency and volume were prioritized. The system was designed to deliver products in quantities that exceeded minimum requirements, ensuring that temporary disruptions or increased demand could be accommodated without rationing or scarcity. American military planners had learned from British experiences in World War I that maintaining morale required attention to small comforts, that cigarettes and coffee and chocolate were not luxuries but necessities for men facing combat stress. Providing these items in abundance was strategic policy, not accidental excess. Yamamoto learned that American soldiers received not just cigarettes, but complete packages of comfort items through various programs. The United Service Organizations, USO, provided entertainment, recreation facilities, and care packages. The Red Cross distributed supplementary supplies including cigarettes, candy, and toiletries. Religious organizations sent packages to service members, and families could mail packages directly to soldiers, supplementing official rations with items from home. The combined effect was that American soldiers had access to consumer goods that exceeded what many American civilians enjoyed during wartime rationing. This comprehensive support system extended to prisoners of war as well, though at reduced levels. Under Geneva Convention protocols, which American authorities followed despite Japan's non-ratification, prisoners were entitled to rations equivalent to what rear area American troops received. In practice, this meant Japanese prisoners in American camps ate better than Japanese soldiers in combat zones, had access to more medical care than Japanese civilians, and received better living conditions than Japanese military barracks provided even in peacetime. The irony was not lost on the prisoners. They had been taught that capture meant torture and death, that Americans were barbarians who respected no humanitarian codes. Instead, they found themselves better fed, better housed, and better treated as prisoners than they had been as soldiers in their own army. The cognitive dissonance created psychological stress that some prisoners never resolved. They had been dishonored by capture according to Japanese military culture, yet Their material conditions had improved. They were supposed to prefer death to capture, yet continued living revealed truths they would never have learned if they had died fighting. As the war progressed and more prisoners arrived at camps throughout Hawaii and the continental United States, the patterns Yamamoto had observed became statistical data points that American intelligence analyzed for insights into Japanese morale and industrial capacity. Interrogation reports consistently noted prisoner shock at American abundance. The reports documented specific observations: discarded food, wasted fuel, replacement rather than repair of equipment, and overwhelmingly, the cigarette waste that seemed to symbolize the entire economic disparity. Military intelligence officers compiled these observations into assessments that informed strategic planning. If Japanese soldiers were shocked by rear area American abundance, their understanding of American industrial capacity was fundamentally flawed. This meant Japanese strategic planning was based on incorrect assumptions about American staying power, about the sustainability of American war production, about the possibility of negotiating a favorable peace by inflicting sufficient casualties to break American will. Japanese planners thought America would tire of the war. American production figures suggested America could sustain the war indefinitely at increasing intensity. Some prisoners, particularly officers and senior enlisted men, eventually cooperated with American intelligence beyond basic interrogation. They provided detailed information about Japanese defensive preparations, tactical doctrines, supply conditions, and morale factors. Their motivation was complex. Some believed the war was lost and that cooperation would shorten it, saving lives on both sides. Some were genuinely shocked by what they had learned about relative industrial capacity and felt their leaders had lied to them. Some simply found that life as a cooperative prisoner was preferable to the alternatives available to them. One lieutenant colonel, captured on Peleliu in late 1944, provided extensive information about Japanese defensive tactics and tunnel fortification techniques. During his interrogation, he explained his reasoning to American officers. Japan had already lost the war, he said. Japanese industrial production could not match American output. Japanese supply lines were broken by American submarines. The home islands would be bombed, invaded, and occupied. Continuing to fight only increased the suffering of Japanese soldiers and civilians. If his information helped end the war faster, he was serving Japanese interests more effectively than he had by fighting. After the war ended in August of 1945, Japanese prisoners faced uncertain futures. Repatriation was slow, complicated by logistical challenges and by questions about how returning prisoners would be received in Japan. Military culture that had condemned surrender as ultimate dishonor now had to accommodate thousands of men who had been captured and who had survived. Some prisoners feared they would face criminal charges or social ostracism. Their fears were not entirely unfounded. Yamamoto was repatriated in December of 1945, arriving at Uraga Port near Yokohama aboard a Liberty ship converted to troop transport. The processing was perfunctory. He was questioned briefly about his capture and imprisonment. Given documentation of his service record, including the notation that he had been a prisoner of war, and released to make his own way home. No one thanked him for his service. No one expressed interest in what he had experienced. The shame of capture was implicit in every interaction. He returned to his family's farm in Kyushu to find his father dead from malnutrition-related illness in the final months of the war, his mother struggling to maintain the farm with only his younger sister's help, and the community devastated by years of privation and by the firebombing of nearby Nagasaki. The contrast between the abundance he had witnessed in American prisoner of war camps and the desperate scarcity of post-war Japan was jarring. He had eaten better as a prisoner than his family had eaten during the war's final year. Yamamoto rarely spoke about his experiences as a prisoner. When he did, usually after considerable sake consumption, he focused not on battles or capture, but on the cigarettes. Half-smoked cigarettes thrown away by men who had never known scarcity. Packs discarded with cigarettes still inside. The casual, unconscious waste that revealed more about American power than any weapon or battle could demonstrate. He told his sister once that he had understood Japan would lose the war the moment he picked up that first half-smoked cigarette in the prison camp. No nation that could waste tobacco so casually could be defeated by a nation that smoked cigarette butts. Other veterans, those who had not been captured, sometimes challenged these stories. They accused former prisoners of exaggeration, of making excuses for their dishonor, of spreading defeatist propaganda. But as American occupation brought material goods into Japan, as Douglas MacArthur's administration distributed food aid and rebuilt infrastructure, as Japanese civilians encountered American abundance firsthand, the stories prisoners had told were validated. Americans really did possess resources at scales that seemed impossible by Japanese standards. The cigarette waste that had shocked Yamamoto in 1944 became a symbol in post-war Japanese discussions of why the war had been lost. It appeared in memoirs, in historical analyses, in conversations among veterans. The image of half-smoked American cigarettes lying discarded while Japanese soldiers desperately collected butts to roll new cigarettes encapsulated the economic disparity that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. It was a small thing, tobacco and paper, but it revealed everything about the industrial capacities that determined the war's outcome. In the broader context of World War II, the Japanese prisoner experience with American material abundance illustrated principles that applied across all theaters and all combatants. Modern industrial warfare was decided not primarily by tactics or courage or individual skill, but by economic fundamentals, production capacity, resource availability, logistical efficiency, and technological sophistication. Nations that could mobilize their economies for total war production had overwhelming advantages over nations that could not, regardless of other factors. The cigarette waste observed by Japanese prisoners was matched by similar disparities in every category of military supply. American factories produced more ships, more aircraft, more tanks, more trucks, more weapons, and more ammunition than Japanese factories by margins that ranged from 5-1 to 50-1, depending on the specific item. These production advantages translated directly into battlefield superiority. American forces could afford to be wasteful because they had abundance. Japanese forces had to conserve desperately because they had scarcity. For individual soldiers on both sides, these economic realities created vastly different experiences of war. American soldiers complained about the quality of their rations, about sea rations that were nutritionally adequate but monotonous, about coffee that was too weak, about cigarettes that were not their preferred brand. These complaints were valid from their perspective, reflecting genuine dissatisfaction with less than ideal conditions. But they were complaints born of abundance, of having enough to develop preferences, of being able to distinguish between adequate and optimal. Japanese soldiers did not have the luxury of such complaints. They were grateful when rations arrived at all. They did not debate quality when quantity was uncertain. They did not express brand preferences for cigarettes because any cigarette was precious. The psychological distance between these two experiences of war was vast, and for Japanese prisoners who witnessed both sides, the distance was traumatic to confront. The story of Japanese prisoners and American cigarette waste is not fundamentally about tobacco. It is about the revelation of truth, about the moment when propaganda and ideology collide with material evidence so overwhelming that denial becomes impossible. Yamamoto and thousands of prisoners like him had built their understanding of the world on foundations that proved false. They had believed in Japanese superiority, in the weakness of the enemy, in the possibility of victory through spiritual strength. The half-smoked cigarettes lying in the dust of a prison camp destroyed those beliefs more effectively than any argument or lecture could have done. In the end, the cigarettes were just paper and tobacco, waste products of an industrial system operating at scales that Japanese observers could barely comprehend. But they were also evidence, tangible and irrefutable, that the war Japan was fighting could not be won, that the sacrifices demanded of Japanese soldiers and civilians were being made in service of impossible goals, that courage and duty and willingness to die could not overcome the mathematics of industrial production. For men who had given everything to a cause they believed was righteous and achievable, this truth was devastating, and it began with something as small and ordinary as a discarded cigarette, half-smoked and forgotten, lying in the dirt where abundance had casually dropped it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.